Hi, I am Maribel Morey. This is Café en Casa, a collaboration between the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences and MISS-NCOBPS. The Miami Institute, established in 2020, is a nonprofit organization bringing together global majority scholars in the social sciences and neighboring fields to amplify their work and to discuss knowledge production in their fields. In promoting a more equitable exchange of knowledge at the national and international levels, the Miami Institute aims to strengthen the integrity and rigor of these fields and help build more equitable national and international political economies. Café en Casa is a virtual series, again, created by the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences and the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, MISS-NCOBPS, bringing together scholars and activists across generations in dialogue on research and memory, on what it means to achieve greater equality, liberation, and human dignity at the local, national, regional, and global levels. Today, we are hearing from Drs. Andrew Douglas and Jared Loggins in dialogue with Dr. Rachel Harding. Dr. Andrew Douglas is Professor of Political Science at Morehouse College. Dr. Douglas is the author of In the Spirit of Critique, Thinking Politically in the Dialectical Tradition, 2013, and W.B. Du Bois and the Critique of Competitive Society, 2019. Dr. Douglas is also co-author with Jared Loggins of Prophet of Discontent, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Critique of Racial Capitalism, 2021. Dr. Jared Loggins is a postdoctoral fellow and visiting assistant professor of Black Studies and Political Science at Amherst College. Dr. Loggins is co-author with Dr. Douglas again of Prophet of Discontent. Loggins is working on another book project tentatively titled Darkwater Insurgencies, The Political Aesthetics of Freedom, which uses Du Bois's 1920 book Darkwater as a basis for articulating the political, social, religious, and aesthetic character of Black insurgency in the 1910s and 20s. Their co-authored work, Prophet of Discontent, reconstructs in the working of Martin Luther King Jr. a critical theory of racial capitalism. And in their recently co-authored piece in the Boston Review, titled The Lost Promise of Black Studies, Loggins and Douglas highlight the work of historian Vincent Harding to found the Institute of the Black World, IBW, which, as the authors explain, quote, was established to carry forth a mode of Black scholarship in the spirit of King's later work. Thus, it represents a case study in the challenges, both epistemic and material, of planning and building that beloved community from within the confines of the racial capitalist world order. Daughter of Vincent Harding, Dr. Rachel Harding, will be in conversation. Rachel Harding is Associate Professor of Indigenous Spiritual Traditions at the University of Colorado, Denver. Dr. Harding is author of A Refuge in Thunder, Candomblé and Alternative Spaces of Blackness, 2000, and Remnants, A Memoir of Spirit, Activism and Mothering, 2015, which combines her own writings with those of her mother, Rosemarie Freeney Harding, on the role of compassion and spirituality in African-American social justice organizing. So we came to this, and we're very excited for this conversation because we found a lot of inspiration in your Boston Review piece and the project of IBW as far as what the Miami Institute is trying to achieve. So we look forward to this discussion very much. And for the audience, please note that their book, at least Dr. Loggins and Douglas's book, Prophet of Discontent, is available open access and can be read free online. We will provide that link. And if you want to buy the copy of the book, we'll also give you a code for a more pleasant access to the pricing at UGA. So I leave it to the three of you to have a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maribel, for that introduction. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So let me set the stage, and then we can kind of we'll sort of get into it. So a week before King is assassinated in Memphis, he is in New York City in the home of Harry Belafonte. He's joined there with a number of his confidants, including Andrew Young and Stanley Levinson, among several others. Earlier that day, King had met Amiri Baraka in Newark, New Jersey. At that time, Newark was teetering on the brink of unrest, and it was a city that King feared was poised to erupt all over again. At that time, of course, King was organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a mass demonstration that meant to press the American people into a serious confrontation with material poverty. King sort of confided in his confidants in New York that the meeting in Newark with Baraka had gotten to him. He saw in Newark the suffocating conditions and an increasing willingness among the city's youth to embrace violent resistance tactics that were testing his long haul strategy of nonviolent change. And so King says to his confidants in New York City that evening in March 1968, I wholly embrace everything they feel. I have more in common with these young people than with anybody else in the movement. I feel their rage. I feel their pain. I feel their frustration. It's the system that is the problem. It's the system that is choking the breath out of their lives. And it was Andrew Young, of all people, the future US Congressman and ambassador to the UN, who sort of pushed back against King's pronouncement. And of course, just several years ago, this is the Andrew Young who sort of got into some trouble, kind of talking down and patronizing young organizers by calling them unlovable brats. He later apologized for the remarks, but it does sort of give us a sense that kind of Andrew Young was sort of on one side, and young people were on the other, and so King sort of responds to Young. He says, "I don't know." Young sort of responds to King and says, "I don't know, Martin. It's not the entire system. It's only part of it, and I think we can fix that." King wasn't having it, and he responds to Young by saying, "I don't need to hear from you, Andy. You're a capitalist and I'm not. The trouble is that we live in a failed system. Capitalism does not permit an even flow of economic resources. With this system, a small privileged few are rich beyond conscious, and almost all others are doomed to be poor at some level. That's the way the system works. And since we know that the system will not change the rules, we're going to have to change the system." And the comments given in the context of his visit to Newark, a city that is on the brink of violence, in the wake of a city that is in the wake of abandonment and disrepair, captures how King is coming to think about the relationship between racial violence and accumulation. Racial capitalism suffocates, right? And not just in a material sense, but in a lived and embodied and spiritual sense as well. The ability for people to pursue a full and flourishing life is hamstrung by the fact that capitalism racially commodifies and divides the humans, so that the poor, the Black poor, are especially vulnerable to capitalism's predations. And so the reason we sort of opened the book with this moment in Newark, in New York City, is because it sets the stage for both a diagnostic critique of capitalism and capitalism's racial politics, but it also helps us to sort of begin to think about a speculative account of what we ought to do in response to racial capitalist conditions. So that's the sort of the big picture. And Andrew, I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about what we're doing methodologically and substantively in the book.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. And just very briefly, because I want to kick this over to Rachel pretty quickly here, so that we can talk about the legacy of the Harding family and the IBW. But again, the reason we thought to start with the anecdote that Jared just shared was in part because this Cafe and Casa series, as we understand, is meant to be sort of an intergenerational dialogue. And so we're thinking about, King sort of listening to young people, trying to sort of think about the frustrations that they're experiencing in the world and how to wrestle with that. What we do in the book is we're political theorists. So we're not, I don't think of myself as an historian. I'm certainly not a scholar of theology or so we thought, what could we do in terms of writing something about King that would be new and different, that would enable us to push the literature on King, to invoke some new conversations about King. And as political theorists, we've been doing some work on racial capitalism, each of us, in different ways. And we thought that this language of racial capitalism, which is a language, set of conceptual resources that King did not have at his disposal when he was working, but it can be applied to King's work in some really generative ways. And so what we're doing is we're sort of using this language of racial capitalism to reconstruct the critical theory of capitalism that King's vision presupposes. And central to the book is the question of how is King's famous call for a radical revolution of values. And that's a phrase that owes quite a bit to Vincent Harding. This is a phrase that we see on very prominent display in the speech Beyond Vietnam, or Time to Break Silence, April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the day before King was assassinated in Memphis. He gives this speech calling for a radical revolution of value. This becomes one of the most prominent, of course, Vincent Harding was one of the key authors of this speech. Harding was teaching at Spelman at the time. And this becomes one of the most commonly cited passages from King's body of work, this idea that we need to bring about a radical revolution of values. And our question is, how is this call for a radical revolution of values complicated by the production and circulation of value in capitalist society? And I'm just going to read a quote here from Vincent Harding from his book, Inconvenient Hero, a very short quote, where he says that King, as the quote, was wise enough to know that you can't get at values just by saying you're going to get at values. You've also got to get at the structures that support those values. And what we try to do in the book is show that, King, this great, he's often remembered as this sort of rhetorician, this idealist preaching these lofty ideals and so on and so forth, but he had a deeply materialist streak to his criticism, to his work, to his mobilizing work, his organizing work, to the work of the movement of which he was a part and an expression. And so we spend a lot of time in the book thinking about what that critique of the material structures of capitalist society entail for King, and again, how this this call for a radical revolution of values is complicated by the production and circulation of value under capitalism. And again, we use this language of racial capitalism, which, as some of you may know, tries to think about capitalism and racism together as inextricably bound, that capitalism both requires and reproduces inequality as a matter of course, and racism enshrines that inequality. And so we spend a lot of time in the book sort of trying to rebuild the sort of political theory, the critical theory that undergirds King's vision. He was out on the road giving speeches, and was not sort of sitting around as we do in libraries and in classrooms trying to sort of think around how to articulate the theories. And what we're trying to do is just sort of reconstruct this critical theory and invite a new generation of readers who are interested in this language of racial capitalism into King's life and work in some new ways. And we conclude the book with a chapter on what we call the afterlives of King's critique. And this is where we pick up with Vincent Harding's work and the establishment of the Institute of the Black World in the early 1970s. And at this point, if I could maybe invite Rachel, Dr. Harding, to join the conversation, to maybe say a bit about her father's role in King's life toward the end and sort of the establishment of the Institute of the Black World in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s. And then we can take it from there and discuss some other things.
Okay, thank you so much. It's good to be with all of you. I'm very happy for the invitation to be in conversation today. I'm going to start just a little bit prior to the period that you've asked about and setting the stage, because I think it's important to understand how my dad and my mother, who were partners in the work in the movement, got to Atlanta, and then how IBW grew out of the work that they set for themselves. So my dad was born in New York, the son of Barbadian Bajan immigrants. And my mother was from Chicago, although her family, our family on my mom's side, has roots in Georgia. And we were among those many millions of people who left the South during the Great Migration. My parents met in Chicago in the Mennonite Church, which not at that time and not at the present is a place well known for large population of Black people. And I won't go into all of the details about how that happened, but they were in different kind of branches of the Mennonite Church. And both of them were attracted, this is in the early and mid 50s, they were attracted to the peace witness of the Mennonites, something that they share with other Anabaptist traditions, with the Quakers, with the Church of the Brethren. And so they were working to get the Mennonite Church to embrace more fully its own kind of ideology around reconciliation, around standing with the most vulnerable in the society. And so they convinced the Mennonite Central Committee, which was kind of the service organization of the Mennonite Church, to sponsor a kind of work and living center in Atlanta, Georgia, called the Mennonite House, which was run by my parents. And it was the first, from what I understand, the first Black-run social service center of the Mennonite Church, certainly in the United States, and definitely in the South. And it was a place that became a kind of work and conversation and study center for movement people. When my parents moved south, they moved to Houston Street and actually were living right around the corner from Martin and Coretta King, and became very good friends with them in the context of doing this work in the early 1960s. Part of their responsibility in a way was kind of just to be witness, observer, participants from the Mennonite denomination to the movement. But as African Americans who were deeply invested and involved and concerned for the transformation of the country, they, as I was saying before, were trying constantly to push the Mennonite Church beyond the limits of their own kind of ideology. And from my thinking now, particularly of some conversations with both my dad and mom about their early work with King, one of the things that I think Martin and Coretta too appreciated in a particular kind of way about my parents was this emphasis on nonviolence, on a peace and reconciling witness as a really fundamental part of who they were as people and their approach to social justice work. So they were often asked to go into situations, into cities where the movement was about to begin major demonstration campaigns. They went to Selma, they went to Albany, Georgia. I believe they were in Birmingham in a similar kind of situation, looking for the white folks and of course, Black leadership who were ready to have conversations in advance of the widespread demonstrations that were being organized. So they did that work kind of in collaboration with SCLC, with CORE, lots of the SNCC young people, particularly those coming out of the Atlanta HBCU church schools and the SNCC office in Atlanta, but also connecting with folks in other parts in Alabama and Mississippi too, came to Mennonite House as a kind of retreat space and as a kind of conversation space. So this was kind of the background of their relationship with Martin and Coretta King. And so when Martin Luther King was assassinated, Coretta asked my dad to be the initial leader of the Martin Luther King Center for, I think at the time it was Nonviolent Social Change. And in the context of that, my dad began a documentation project. He all my life for both better and for worse. My dad was just an incredible archivist, and then he and my cousin Charles Freeney were just. I mean, to this day, I have all kinds of stuff in this house that I don't even know, what to do with, even though most of my dad's papers have been sent to Emory, but he collected everything he could get his hands on, ephemera, books, articles, and of course, all of this is before digitization. So he carried some of that emphasis, both his emphasis as a historian, his emphasis as an archivist, and his concern for the gathering of the stories of the movement to the King Center. And at some point, and there are others like Howard Dotson, who I think would be, I'm sure that Jared and Andrew had some contact with, but who have some powerful stories of the origins of IBW. What I know is that at some point it became clear to my dad that it was important to have a space that, as Jared and Andrew were suggesting, was able to try to continue the energy, the vision, the expansiveness of the movement for really fundamental transformation in the country, and connect it to anti-imperialist and anti-colonial movements around the world. And at a certain level, a number of the folks in the structure of the King Center were uncomfortable with that for a variety of reasons. And so while the Institute of the Black World initially kind of was situated as a project of the King Center, within a year or two of its initiation, it became its own center on Beckwith Street in Atlanta, near where the present AU Central Library is.
Yeah, thank you so much for this background. I mean, if I could just jump in here. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to think about, I think, with this conversation is sort of the work of institution building and how difficult it is to build Black institutions, transformative institutions, institutions that really critique structure, right? Imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, white supremacism, patriarchy. And how difficult it is to sort of find material support to be able to facilitate that work. And we have a number of institutions already in this conversation that we've talked about, from Mennonite House to the HBCUs in Atlanta, to the King, what was initially the King Memorial Center, now the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, also the IBW. What attracted us to the IBW as part of the story that we're trying to tell about King's critique of capitalism is that in the moment of his assassination, April '68, there was sort of the move to build an institution to carry on his legacy. And of course, that was, you know, the work of Coretta Scott King and the King Center, and that took it in one path, right? That took his legacy down one sort of path. And what Jared and I sort of have been wrestling with is how Vincent Harding and others associated with the IBW kind of moved to carry on the King legacy in a different sort of way. And I think they saw themselves as doing that, even if they weren't sort of touting the King name out front, but they sort of carried on maybe a more radical, more anti-imperialist, more anti-capitalist version of King than we are accustomed to some 50 years on, right? We've been given this in Cornell Westward sort of sanitized King's legacy, this kind of liberal electoral politics, you know, focus on sort of nonviolent reconciliation without thinking about really what that means in terms of building out institutions and structures that could actually make good on those values and commitments. And so that drew us to the IBW. And the other piece of the IBW that we were interested in was its academic side. You know, Jared and I teach at an HBCU. You know, Jared, once we grew out of came out of up through an HBCU, and we're trying to think about what these institutions can do in terms of facilitating the kind of study and critique and sort of intellectual life of a kind of Black radical movement. And that was, of course, central to what the IBW was trying to do. And they had to separate themselves from the Black colleges because the Black colleges were not hospitable to that kind of work in that time. And that is maybe also true in our own time. I don't know, but we're, you know, so I don't really have a question here. I'm just trying to sort of connect some dots that I think we've already sort of put out. Jared, do you have anything you want to pick up on what Rachel said?
I was going to say that, I mean, the interesting story about the relationship between IBW and HBCUs, in particular Atlanta University, is that it partly suggests, part of that kind of conflict there suggests that the kind of Black institution is like not naturally radical, right? To the extent that academics, radical academics, you know, are kind of invested in doing work on Black colleges. In many ways, that work is transgressive. That has something to do with all kinds of external imperatives and external demands that are brought to bear on the university, the Black university, that, you know, that kind of pose a challenge to a kind of radical project, right? And so for Harding anyway, right, he's sort of thinking about this question of relative autonomy, because he's like, you know, what does it mean to sort of develop a kind of intellectual program, a space to get together and study that is not circumscribed by the strictures of the university. A university apparatus that is fundamentally about shoring up its own position, that is about investing in, you know, the commodification of knowledge production and so forth. This is not to say that like IBW doesn't run into its own kinds of internal contradictions and problems, right? They're there. But really, it seems to me anyway that what Harding and Henderson and the folks who they're bringing to the IBW are thinking through these contradictions. Like, what does it mean to build a kind of transformative institutional space that can carry forth a radical critique, and that could also turn that radical critique into like politics, into real transformative change. Rachel, did you want to jump in?
No, go ahead. I won't forget, and I'll probably connect it to whatever it is that you.
Well, I wanted to ask about indigenous knowledge production, because one thing that's like interesting about IBW is that to some degree, so there is the kind of intellect, they're bringing in academics, folks who are situated in the context of the university. Harding himself is an historian, Chicago trained historian, but there also seems to be an investment in indigenous knowledge production. And I'm wondering if you can sort of talk about that. And also, like, this is, the indigenous knowledge production is also critical, I think, to what you're doing in Remnants. You're telling a story about how the production of knowledge ideas is sort of developing from below, right? That it doesn't have a kind of intellectual pretense at all. It's about transformation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. your question and the movement of the conversation is reminding me of a talk that I gave maybe about a month ago for the University of North Carolina, Asheville, about my parents and the concept of fugitivity in their life and work. And I think this issue of indigenous knowledge, where IBW is concerned, and in a broader sense of kind of how my parents, my family have functioned on the margins of academia, and in some ways how Black studies was certainly initially conceived as this space where the understandings, the commitments, the concerns of the larger Black community are brought into meaningful engagement and you know, are not marginalized from the discipline. So you know, as I think about this, in many ways, I think we can say this of almost all of the institutions, certainly the ones that my family has been involved in creating or participating in, have been these quilombo spaces, you know, these spaces of maroonage, these spaces of fugitivity, these spaces where people are creating both the physical, the psychic, the cultural, the spiritual space to be able to hold on to another meaning of ourselves and to cultivate that so that it's available to as a resource for transforming the larger society. You know, I growing up, I wasn't, you know, clearly as conscious of this kind of thing as I am now, but you know, it was just before our conversation, I was looking at John Bracey and Sonia Sanchez's book on the Black arts movement, and just thinking about, you know, from my own memories. I was born in 1962, so, you know, by the late 60s, I was certainly very conscious. I remember King's assassination and funeral, and then, you know, about the early and mid 70s, I was just, I'm trying to think of the right word. The country that I lived in was just this tremendously creative, fertile place, full of Black arts, full of poetry, full of dance, full of theater. And these were institutions, independent Black schools all over the country that I was able to experience because my dad and mom would be invited to speak or to do workshops or to participate in conferences. And I'm conscious now, you know, as a teacher, as a scholar, of how little we really understand in 2021 of this just powerful time of imagining and possibility that grew up in many ways profoundly inspired by the Southern Freedom Movement, but that just caught fire everywhere. The Chicano rights movement, the Native American movement, what was called Women's Lib at the time, the gay and lesbian movement, the peace movement. I mean, and so one of my interests and concerns is to kind of reacquaint ourselves with that powerful history that's not so far. I mean, it's my lifetime, you know, in our country as a resource for precisely what you're asking, Jared, these ways of understanding who we are, where we come from, what we have to draw on for the work of transforming our society. There's just a whole lot more here than we recognize.
And it has me thinking too about Andrew and Rachel about the undercommons, We were
Yeah.
talking about, you know, in the piece, we kind of talk about, you know, this fugitive space of study, right? And Moten and Harney, they say, right, in a passage, the idea of study is that is about what you do with other people. It's talking and walking around with other people. It's working. It's dancing, right? It's suffering. Some irreducible convergence of all three held under the name of speculative practice. Right, there is no precedent for the and there isn't necessarily a roadmap for you know, sort of rich cultural, aesthetic, political space that is gesturing to another world. And nevertheless, right, it is speculative. It is gesturing forward, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just maybe to try to tie this into the overarching theme of you know, of our book, racial capitalism, and how we're trying to think about how it is that these manufactured, socially constructed regimes and structures of our society. There's nothing natural about the capitalist mode of production, right? It's built historically contingent. But how this all prevents this kind of undergirding sociality from flourishing, right? I mean, if we think about, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, this famous refrain that King keeps coming back to: lonely islands of poverty in a vast sea of prosperity. And, you know, Rachel, as I was rereading Remnants this past week in preparation for this, I was just struck by this theme of abundance. I mean, you start the book with this, or your mother starts the book, I guess the two of you together working on the book, with this beautiful poem, just right off the bat, sort of challenging this notion of scarcity. And throughout the book, there's this notion that we always have enough. It's always there, but it's not recognized, or it's trying to sort of surface in a set of material structures that pull it apart, that pit one part against another and hold us into competitive relations. Or if we think about, you know, the way in which, and all sorts of sort of wedges are sort of thrown in to sort of break apart sociality and beloved community, whether it's race, whether it's gender, right? And if we just think about who gets recognized when we try to remember these movements and think about them, versus who gets pushed to the background and disremembered, misrecognized, unrecognized. You know, that's a version of this as well, right? But, and so we have to sort of break through this sort of manufactured scarcity, this sort of manufactured competitive environment, in order to allow this sociality, right? What King maybe would have called the beloved community, to kind of surface. It's always there, but it's fugitive, it's fleeting. We see remnants of it, we see moments of it, right? And the question is, how do we restructure our society so that we can live it in its fullness more consistently, more sustainably?
Good. Excellent.
Can I? So I have the poem pulled up. It's a really powerful poem. Can I read it?
Please do. It's a great poem.
And presumably these are your mother's work. This is your mother's poem, I think, right?
Well, I wrote it, but it's based in what she gave me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is no scarcity. There is no shortage. No lack of love, of compassion, of joy in the world. There is enough. There is more than enough. Only fear and greed make us think otherwise. No one needs starve. There is enough land and enough food. No one need die of thirst. There is enough water. No one need live without mercy. There is no end to grace, and we are all instruments of grace. The more we give it, the more we share it, the more we use it, the more God makes. There is no scarcity of love. There is plenty and always more. That's just like, wow, right? And it has me thinking about, you know, how distorted our society must be, how depraved it must be to sort of rob people of these sort of resources, to rob people of love, to rob people of connection and belonging, right? And in many ways, I think, the beloved community is in some ways trying to restore this. is trying to restore a sense of belonging, a sense of togetherness, which has been taken away by these institutions, which, pit us against each other, right? They're death dealing. They're not about the affirmation of life.
Yes. Again, as I'm listening to you, one thing that comes to my mind as I think about how my mom and dad across, more than 50 years of this work in various cities, in various circumstances, sometimes with regular jobs, sometimes without regular work. I mean, how they held on to this vision of there being another possibility for us in this country, both for people of African descent and for the nation as a whole, as a vision of a healthy, just, multiracial democracy in this place. How did they hold on to that? And one of the things that comes to my mind most strongly is that they first of all, in some ways, I want to say they caught that vision, or the vision was reaffirmed for them, because I think both of them in different ways kind of had it planted in their childhood experiences. My dad, in the context of the small West Indian Seventh-day Christian church community that he grew up in. My mom in our very large, extended, transplanted Southern extended family in Chicago. So, and one of the things that I try to do with my mom's case in Remnants is show how some of those values around the possibilities of beloved community, of a healthy multiracial democracy in the US, were things that were instilled in her in the way that our family lived, the way that my grandparents approached the challenges of being Southern African American, initially agrarian folks who were who moved to the north. But in my life, what I saw was my folks hold very closely, consider very precious the relationships with other activists, with other movement people who they were connected to. I know, I mean, it's not to over romanticize it, because, there's lots of issues, but fundamentally, what I saw them do, especially as I got older and more conscious, and then, began to participate in this at a certain level, was by the mid-70s, they were periodically gathering people. First at the Pendle Hill Study Center outside of Philadelphia, and then through some Lilly grants, and then Bob Moses, when he got his MacArthur money, gave a good chunk of it to my folks at the Isla School of Theology, primarily to bring former movement activists and younger activists together to just be together. To be together, to think together, to share stories, to share strategies, to sing, to eat good food. There's a whole series of gatherings that they organized. As I said, the ones that I'm particularly conscious of were starting in the late 70s, and this was a really important aspect of the way they kept their spirits encouraged and shared that with other folks who were working. So just in terms of thinking about your question, Andrew, of, what are those structures that we need? And of course there are, the larger question is about the societal structures that make this possible, but also, you know, as we are moving toward that, what is it that we can and need to do to keep each other encouraged and to keep our eyes on the prize, so to speak, of you know, what we're moving for and what we're trying to create.
Yeah, and let me maybe jump in, and I wanted to, I don't know if this is the right time to share this, but I wanted to be sure to share this at some point in this conversation, which is one of really what drew me initially to Vincent Harding, was that I'd been doing some work on Du Bois and was interested in the sort of vision for the Black university concept that he developed really in the 1930s and 40s. And then, you know, I stumbled upon this essay. This was before Jared and I even started this project on King. This essay that Vincent Harding had published in Ebony magazine in, I want to say 1970, called, you know, Toward the Black University, which is an essay that I come back to monthly. And it's just a fantastic, I think of it as a Du Boisian kind of vision for a Black university that is not, as Harding puts it, a dark copy of dying whiteness, right? The famous quote that I love is that, you know, we do not need dark copies of dying whiteness. The point is that these white world institutions of higher education, these universities, right, many of which started off as slaveholding entities or land grant, you know, displacing indigenous peoples, institutions that come out of that history, but that continue basically today as hedge funds that run, you know, an educational side hustle for tax purposes, right? I mean, these kinds of institutions, if we're trying to build a sort of a Black institution that can educate and sort of develop a population that can lead a revolutionary transformation of a world that is just completely bankrupt, violent, irredeemable. We cannot replicate what the Harvards of the world are doing or what the land grant university system has done and continues to do. And that requires a radical rethinking of what these spaces are, can, should, must be. That these are not places where people go to get rich, right? That these are not places where we need to be chasing big grants to fund research. It gets into some tricky territory because there's this question of, well, okay, if you know, the Harvards of the world are going to do this and you've got all these resources and all this sort of stuff, you know, go develop a Black studies program there or whatever. And, you know, we're just going to be sort of settling at HBCUs with limited resource constraints and try to do the best that we can from a kind of moral high ground based upon that, right? And on the one hand, that seems really problematic. Right, but it's part of this sort of effort to rethink, you know, institutions that bring and hold people together and produce knowledge and produce community and produce good work without being dependent upon the reproduction of violence, extraction, exploitation, inequality, either in our own backyards or in other parts of the world, and that our endowments are fueling, right? And so again, I don't really have a question here. I'm just sort of thinking aloud. But if either of you want to jump on in that, I wanted to be sure to bring in again one of my favorite essays of Vincent Harding. I think it's Ebony, August 1970, Toward the Black University, and I highly recommend that essay if folks haven't read it.
Yeah, I think often about another essay, The Vocation of the Black Scholar. I mean, this is where I think, you know, Harding is sort of wrestling with the contradiction of, you know, of trying to produce a kind of liberatory, kind of intellectual project in the context of the university. So he's sort of thinking seriously about, okay, in the context of the university, as just a kind of pragmatic move, what does it mean for Black scholars to fashion themselves against, you know, the sort of prevailing wisdom of, like, you know, the white world? So it's interesting, right? Because it seems to me that to some extent, you know, Harding and a number of, you know, the folks who are affiliated with IBW, they're sort of ambivalent, and they sort of go back and forth about about the kind of institution of the university. On the one hand, they're sort of thinking in the context, they're thinking about building Black studies programs, right? But then the very example of the IBW is about sort of pushing beyond the sort of confines of Black studies departments in the context of universities that, as Andrew says, are necessarily kind of extractive and exploitative. So it seems to me anyway that Harding, particularly in the vocation essay, is kind of wrestling with the contradictions. I don't think, there isn't a kind of easy kind of answer here. And it seems to me that, radical scholars are kind of going back and forth, are by necessity kind of moving back and forth between, like, okay, do we finally sort of take flight from the university, or pragmatically do we sort of work through the contradictions, right?
And I think for many people, they did both, necessarily, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of these periodic gatherings and conferences and, just meetings to think through where we are and where we need to go were a means of sometimes using the resources of, the institutions with the money to think in some other directions. And to do that often in spaces that were not in the physical location of the universities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, we quote Lerone Bennett in the 5th chapter. It doesn't appear in the Boston Review piece, but in the longer chapter, there is a, Lerone Bennett kind of talks about, he sort of raises this question about what does it mean to sort of for IBW to accept blood money, right?
Yes.
And there is this kind of contest, this internal conflict within IBW leadership about whether to ultimately sort of accept philanthropic dollars. And some of it has to do with this anxiety about philanthropy as a kind of thing that sort of conditions and disciplines like acceptable ideological kind of viewpoints, right? We kind of talk about a little bit in the longer chapter, in that 5th chapter, the IBW chapter, about, we're drawing on Robert Allen's Black Awakening in Capitalist America, which, by the way, this was like one of the key texts that IBW were sort of reading and thinking about. But Allen in that book kind of talks about how philanthropy sort of emerged as this kind of apparatus that was conditioning what was and was not acceptable for Black, in terms of Black descent, right? Philanthropy foundation, like the Ford Foundation, for example, in the late 1960s, was was giving money to all sorts of organizations, and the kind of wink and nod had to do with, okay, yeah, but you can't be too radical. You can't say that. You can't say that. This is explored in more detail in a book called Andrew's escaping me, the what is it? The funding when the revolution will not be funded.
Will not be funded. Yeah,
the Insight Women of Color Collective. So there's this real kind of conflict question about what does it even mean to engage pragmatically with the university that is deeply invested in reproducing dispossession and exploitation and so forth. I wanted to Rachel, you were talking a moment ago about kind of the sort of the way that movement leaders are engaged intergenerationally. Mm-hmm. There was a moment in Remnants where you talk about your mom at the Veterans of Hope, I guess, documentary filming at the Fetzer Institute, where your mom kind of intervenes. your mom sort of intervenes where, you know, there are these two younger activist filmmakers who feel alienated. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because that seems to be a key moment where kind of, you know, the kind of intergenerational, you know, your mom there is sort of trying to bridge a kind of intergenerational divide, right?
Yeah. So again, you know, just a little bit of context. My folks were very much involved with Black Side and the filmmaking kind of cadre that Henry Hampton created or drew together to do Eyes on the Prize. And in some ways, that experience, I'm sure, inspired my dad in particular to do these intergenerational gatherings of activists by the mid 90s and then into the early 2000s. Because he saw how powerful the experience of making Eyes on the Prize, that, you know, kind of seminal documentary history of the Southern Freedom Movement was, and the process that the Black Side filmmaking company used, which brought participants, scholars, artists, filmmakers together kind of for several days of production school before sending them out to do the work. And so this event that Jared is referring to, if I'm not mistaken, I think happened in about 2000. And Orlando Bagwell, who was one of the principal filmmakers, and he actually worked at Ford after being with Black Side and having his own company, Roha Productions, for a number of years. He came with two younger filmmakers to film this gathering of, it's an intergenerational gathering of activists. And I think Grace Boggs was there, Zahara Simmons, I think Maisha Moses, Bob Moses's oldest daughter, a number of people from the movement period, and then some younger folks. But the people who were making the film, who were working with Orlando, who were assisting him, were increasingly, we were there for maybe 3 or 4 days, a long weekend, as the conversations were centering a lot on the 60s and 70s. These younger people who were not connected, they were not the children of activists, they were not people who'd grown up, you know, in an activist community, they were just filmmakers who were working with Orlando Bagwell. And they started to feel less and less connected to what was happening, even though the conversation, you know, was about movement and about the continuing work of transforming the society, but they didn't hear themselves represented or see or feel themselves represented in the conversation. And so on the very last day, one of the sisters, I think she was doing like the second camera, and people were going around the circle, you know, kind of talking about what they were going to take away from this moment. And I think I have it in the book. I don't remember exactly now, you know, what her words were, but essentially she was saying, you know, I don't know what you all are talking about, but it doesn't have anything to do with me. And I'm upset about this because you all are supposed to be like representing, you know, us and the work of you know, getting this country right. And y'all don't even see us, or it feels like you don't see us. And my mom went over to her and just put her arm around her and basically said, if this is how you're feeling, then we are doing something fundamentally wrong. Because if our children don't feel that we love them, can't see that, don't know that, then nothing else that we're doing matters. And it just was a moment that then opened a space for even though it was the last, it was the very, like the last hour and a half or 2 hours of the event that we had together, it was like, that was the point at which some real engagement began to happen. Because this young woman, was just fed up and able to say what she needed to say. And my mom responded in a way of saying, okay, if this is what's happening, then we got to do this completely differently. So.
That's great. I mean, in a way, this brings us kind of full circle to where Jared began the conversation today, and with the sort of anecdote that we begin the book with, where, King is sort of stressing out that sort of youth in Newark on the brink of riotous protests are feeling a certain way, and they're just not getting a sense that the movement in its kind of officialdom is sort of connected, right? And he's sort of stressing about this and thinking about how, he needs to sort of ramp up or express a kind of sharper structural critique to sort of get at some of the material circumstances that folks, young people in places like Newark are experiencing in 67, 68. So we only have about 10 minutes left. And so maybe if we could turn now, I don't want to shortchange Jared or Rachel, if you have anything else you want to discuss, but if there are any questions in the audience, either put them in the chat or feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. Patrick, Morehouse student, good to see you here. What's the question?
Yeah, it's very familiar setting.
Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir, no problem. So my name is Patrick Darrington. I'm a senior political science major from Cincinnati, Alabama. I attend Morehouse College, as my terrific professor just told you guys. Yeah, me and him, we have a very cool relationship. So yeah, so my question is just, so like I'm thinking about the recent verdict when it comes to Kyle Rittenhouse. And so like, as that relates to like sort of topic around like Black activism, Black solidarity, and just how the state seems to be prepping for something. Like, so in regards to the fact that it seems as though white vigilantism is being given like a cover for protests that are to come in response to particularly like COVID doesn't seem to be going anywhere. There seems to be a movement of like social democracy. So like Bernie Sanders and like AOC, different things of that nature. I don't really know where I'm going with this question. It's just like, yeah, when it comes to like these spaces, I guess, and like trying to find that beloved community, how harder do you guys think that will continue to become as like the state, capitalism, conservatives, yeah, all that continues to like move against any type of growth. So yeah, and sorry, because it's sort of like off the top of my head.
No, thank you for that, Patrick.
Andrew, did you want to? Well,
go ahead.
The struggle against we kind of talk about this in the book, but the struggle against racial capitalism, it sort of requires a great deal of sacrifice. And the other part of this too is that let me back up. So the context that is important here is that the individuals that were killed by Kyle Rittenhouse were folks who were protesting, who were at protests in defense of Black life, right? They were struggling in some ways against the kind of this racial capitalist society that polices and controls Black life, right? They're allies. These are folks who, at the moment in which they kind of put their lives on the line in defense of Black life, they became sort of vulnerable in the way that in the same way that that many Black and brown people are sort of vulnerable when they sort of struggle against this sort of racial capitalist society, right? And you know, I don't I think that um, the struggle goes on. We have to struggle. I mean, what is the alternative, right? I'm always thinking about like the question, what is the alternative to struggling against this? And you know, it seems to me that we sort of have to just tap in and find ways, you know, organize wherever we can, however we can, and with not just with you know, Black folks, but organize with white folks, with allies across from different groups who are struggling and thinking through, you know, a sort of society, trying to imagine a society that is not sort of reproduce death, right?
Yeah, I would maybe just add, I mean, you know, we're using this sort of framework of racial capitalism throughout this book. You know, and yeah, I guess is another name for racial capitalism just fascism, right? I mean, it seems that we're sort of headed down a path toward fascism in a lot of ways, right? That the sort of deeply racially motivated violence from the state and sort of officialdom of the public sector all the way down through civil society. Yeah, I think the history of racial capitalism is this kind of dialectical movement of where the violence kind of gets blinded from view, pushed to other sort of parts of the world in a kind of globalized sort of framework, covered up, where in other moments it sort of bursts out into the open. And, you know, so we're sort of thinking of, you know, trying to think about how, so the point I'm trying to make here is that I don't think we're ever, and I think this is what we're arguing that King and others were sort of thinking about in their analysis of capitalism and racism too, is that we're never going to be able to get rid of racial violence until we overcome this capitalist structure that both reproduces it and depends upon it, that requires it in order to function and reproduces it as a matter of course. And history is going to continue to be filled with sort of this dialectical movement where that violence kind of gets tamped down for periods. It becomes, you know, NPC. We sort of hide it. We sort of put it behind curtains. We move it to other geographic locations, versus moments when it kind of just sort of bursts into the open in ways that we are, right? And the danger, of course, is that we get desensitized to that violence, whether it's more hidden or more open. Mm-hmm. And so again, I'm not very good at sort of, I'm just sort of thinking aloud here, and I'm inviting folks to kind of think with me. I don't know where this is going necessarily, but welcome reactions to that thought.
This is good. What both of you have shared is stimulating some thoughts for me. Patrick, even though I can't see you, it's nice to meet you. And I think what I would add, you know, as someone who's a historian of religion and a historian of African-American culture, is to always remember that in the midst of both these larger racial capitalist or fascist constructs that we are working in and fighting against and creating, imagining, moving toward alternatives to, we are living organisms. You know, we are alive, we are connected to everything else that is alive. And it's important for us to grieve, to grieve and to do in that process, to do what our ancestors and the ancestors of everybody in this global community who has struggled against these forces, what people have done, which is to come together and use the cultural and spiritual resources, ancestral resources, to regird yourself, because it's very easy to become, as Andrew just said, desensitized to what is happening around us. But when we can be with other people, when we can understand that everything that exists, the land, the trees, the water, the fire, we are in relationship to, and we are, those natural forces can help us. This is something that our ancestors understood in terms of the experience of both maroonage and, going out into the hush harbors, spending time out in the natural world as a way to just get reconnected to that powerful life force in us. So in whatever way, it doesn't necessarily have to be religious. Sometimes poetry does that for us. Music does that for us. Laughing and hanging out with people we love does that for us. But I think it's really important in the midst of all of this that we be intentional about making those moments where we remember our humanity and we feed our humanity so as to protect to some extent against the powerful forces of desensitization that are around us.
Thank you guys so much. And sorry, I want to turn my camera on. It's just because it's finals week, so I'm looking kind of rough right now.
All right, don't worry. Don't you worry.
So, yeah, but thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Well, if anybody doesn't have another question, I mean, because there was another thing on my mind, like we're talking about like solidarity and like talking to people. So like, how much does COVID or has COVID interrupted that, and like sort of like continues to potentially interrupt that, because we see with the new variant now and like how it continues to potentially still mutate, and like how we need that sort of that face-to-face interaction, like for our souls, essentially. And so if this continues, like how much will that sort of interfere, but also like help us understand how important it is for us to be in community with one another, and how that may also be sort of revolutionary potentially, I guess, going forward. So yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking about the kind of the revolutionary potential, right? Given the fact that what the pandemic has made possible is this, right? We can sort of communicate and study and reflect together, and maybe we just have to sort of continue to find ways and opportunities to do this, and sort of build connection under really impossible and difficult circumstances, which, I mean, that is the Black tradition, building connections under, in impossible circumstances. And so I think we have to find ways to kind of continue leaning into that.
And the only thing I would add to that is, I see, Jared and Andrew, the work that you all are doing as an example of the way in which we cull the resources, the inspiration, the encouragement from what I call ancestral sources, and I consider King absolutely an ancestral resource, just as Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, Harriet Tubman, the millions of unnamed ancestors. And just as I understand the natural forces in the world as our ancestors. So to me, it's not disconnected at all. The work of political science, of history, of kind of recovering what it is that will help us reimagine and continue to move and continue to live and continue to do the work that we need to do. Those resources come in so many places and so many shapes and forms. And so what you all are doing is part of that. And what folks do when they do ritual is also part of it. So I would just say for Patrick and others, be open to a variety of ways of connecting to the ancestral resources. Because there's a phrase from the Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian human rights struggle that says, "Nossos passos vêm de longe," which means literally our steps started a long way back, which means our ancestors began this work that this journey that we are on was started many generations before, and we are inheritors of that wisdom, of that indigenous knowledge, of that understanding about what it is to be human. So we're never doing this all by ourselves, and we need to do what we can to remember the way that we are connected to those who came before us.
And now more than ever, being intentional about the ancestors on whom we draw, right? I mean, for me, what was so powerful about, what has been so powerful about King is sort of thinking about, there's been a lot of work that's been done, right? But thinking about King as an ancestor, as a resource, who can aid and fortify, the struggle ahead. And there are so many. I mean, our project is focused on King, but there are so many. And to me, that is the sort of genius of, again, that's the genius of the tradition. That's the genius of sort of drawing on kind of struggle from the past. And what that struggle has done and this is what I think you're getting at, Rachel, what those struggles have done is they've cast a shadow into the present. So we inherit that shadow, we live in that shadow. And we can, in our own sort of action, we also cast the shadow into a future that we may not see.
Or cast a light.
Or cast a light, yes.
Right. Either way, that's right. Good. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we're about 5 or 6 minutes over time, so maybe that's a good place to leave it for now. Thank you so much, Rachel, Jared, Maribel, Miami Institute of Social Sciences, and National Conference of Black Political Scientists. This has really been a real treat for us, so really appreciate it.